Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to Communications in the EMS System. A little bit about myself real quick. My name is Mike Felty and I'm a battalion chief here with the City of Frankfort Fire and EMS. I've been in EMS since 1991, been a paramedic since 1997, and an EMS educator since 1999. This module falls underneath the National Registry Preparatory section and is your basic knowledge of your EMS system, safety, well-being, medical, legal. Some of the things we're going to discuss in this presentation is EMS communications. Communications needed to call for our resources. Communications that transfer of patient care, and how we interact within the team structure. We know that communication is needed to use in the EMS system. We communicate with one another. We're communicating with patients. We're also communicating with other EMS providers as well as at the hospital. And communication is needed when we coordinate care with other healthcare professionals, and ultimately good communication or proper communication is going to improve our team dynamics. So the ability to communicate clearly is a fundamental core and a very important EMS skill. We have to be able to communicate with our dispatch center to let them know that when we're on scene, when we need extra help and those kind of things. We need to be able to communicate with other members of the EMS system. And we need to be able to communicate well with our patients, and not only our patients, but their family members and even bystanders that are on scene. There's many factors that influence how we communicate and how effective our communication is. The style of communication is one thing that can affect that. Knowledge level and your ability to listen and comprehend, as well as your ability to accurately convey information, and then oftentimes life experience as well. Communication can be affected also by your tone of voice, your body language, how you stand, and the ability to use technology. Communication is both an interactive and a circular process. When we talk about this loop of communications, we know that we have to have a sender and a receiver in our loop, and we have to have a message. And with that message, we have to have some type of medium that we are using to transfer or send our message. And we have to realize that just because we have a receiver in that doesn't necessarily mean that the message was decoded and understood. So our sender formulates and encodes the message to be sent. That may involve determining the words or the ideas in that message and how to format that to be sent. And then the message is transmitted to the receiver. The receiver then receives and attempts to decode the message to get the information that has then been relayed. The most common methods of transmitting information would include verbal, sometimes nonverbal, written communications, visual, and then electronic form. And the final step in the effective communication is receiving feedback, which is the confirmation by the receiver that the message was accurately received. And just like I said, just because we have a sender receiver and the message is sent doesn't mean that the message is well understood. And without that feedback, it oftentimes is difficult to make that determination. With the electronic format, one of the downfalls that we see is context. And How do we know when we're sending text or chat messages back and forth that what context that it is sent in? And one of the things that we have that goes along with that format is the little emoticons, the smiley faces and the frowny faces, and the little pictures that we can send with it to help everyone know what that context is. This illustration shows our loop. We have a sender and a receiver in the loop. Again, a message to be transmitted, whether that be verbal, nonverbal, written, visual, so on and so forth. And then feedback ultimately completes that loop, we hope, with confirmation that the message was received. All right, we'll start with verbal communication, and the factors that enhance or impede effective communication can either be the semantic or the technical side of things. Semantics is the meaning of words, and the technical is the hardware, the communication devices and hardware. And in our EMS communication systems, it requires specialized equipment. The systems are often based on radio signals, where we have repeaters, we have handheld and mobile and base unit type radios. And so we need a reliable way to communicate with our medical direction. And oftentimes we have a couple ways that we can do this now. We do communicate by radio signal, and in the cases where that's not working, or we need alternate communications, the cellular network, cell phones, those kind of things work well. Always have a backup system, so especially when we encounter disasters. And I can recall a time that we were having bad thunderstorms, and it knocked out the repeater system. The repeater system was supposed to have a battery backup, but that failed that night, and so we ended up using cellular communications only when we were giving reports to the hospital up until the point in time where we got it repaired. And that was way after the storms had passed through that we finally got the radio system up and working. So a backup plan is always a must. With our radio systems, the critical component of our EMS system, the radio band and the range of radio frequencies that are being used, these frequencies, the number of times per minute a radio wave oscillates is kind of how that works. VHF, UHF, and in digital form. UHF is known as the ultra high frequency, and these are the bandwidths from 300 to 3000 megahertz. How do we know and detect a citizen response? And that's the next few slides is what we're going to talk about. And typically somebody has to, or somebody does recognize that there's something going on, that there's an emergency, and then somebody calls 911. And in today's world that we have many cell phones out there, just about everybody has a cell phone. The days of the old pay phones here, I believe, are over. Most people have cell phones. And there's pros and cons to that. Everybody is directly connected. We can call 911 very quickly, so we are getting calls quicker, and we're getting on the road faster. But then the negative sides of everybody owning a phone is all of our smartphones now have cameras and record video, and so you're under the scrutiny of a camera every time that you respond to and make a call. But this starts with dispatch. Dispatch receiving a call from the telephone lines, and then they start to take in and gather information and start to make decisions. Emergency medical dispatching, or EMD, is one of the more important parts of our team in the EMS system, and it does start with dispatch. So our dispatchers are trained to use this system. They obtain as much information as possible. There are specific tabs that come out on the computer when they pick, for instance, when they pick short of breath, it'll have a tab that will have several questions for them to ask. So it'll go down this line of questioning that's according to that chief complaint, or they try to narrow that down and begin to ask questions for us to gather more information. This directs appropriate vehicles to the scene and helps make appropriate responses. And it also provides the caller with information. So if there's something going on where the caller could possibly help prior to us getting there, those instructions are also within those tabs and drop downs in the computer system, and the dispatcher can relay and coach that information and coach those people to do what is needed. These systems monitors and coordinates communication. So your dispatchers are ultimately responsible for the coordination of all the communications, and then with that they maintain written record reports. And what we should realize, there is written record in the CAD system. It is digital, what they're typing in, and each portion of it is saved and retained, as well as it's recorded. So even the telephone lines that you call into to dispatch are recorded as well. So those conversations, all of those conversations and information is recorded. Upon the receipt of a call, the emergency medical dispatcher first must answer the telephone call promptly and then identify themselves and the agency. They'll speak directly into the microphone or the mouthpiece of the headset that they're wearing, and then observe telephone instructions. They'll take charge of the conversation. Oftentimes when they're getting these type of calls, it's frantic situations for the callers, and so they're trying to be in charge of the conversation and extract as much information as they could possibly get from them for us, so they can A, send the proper response, and then B, make sure that we have the updated information that we may need. Then comes our response to the call. EMS calls originate when, again, somebody recognizes that there is an emergency. They then call 911 or the emergency number, and then the dispatcher will extract and get the information from the caller. Some of the things they're wanting to know right off is location of the patient. We realize that most of these phone calls are traceable, even cellular now. However, they may be calling from a different location. Or maybe even a safer location as well. The phone number of the caller, so that they can be called back if necessary, if there is a disconnection in between the line, or cellular phones, may be in a bad spot and not getting good reception as well. We need a way to call back. Another thing that they want to know is why EMS was called, and this kind of gets us into the thinking mode and the direction of what type of response is needed. And then they start asking questions about patient condition, what's going on with the situation and the patient, and they'll pull up the appropriate tab in the EMD section of the CAD on the computer and be able to begin asking all of those different questions. So basically, when a 911 call comes in, they'll try to get the exact location, telephone number, why did they call EMS, any information about the patient's condition, details about their location, and then information about the situation. And they're also looking for key safety factors for us as well. That this information can be relayed to us and help keep us safe. Response to the call to EMS: as soon as the dispatcher has obtained the address of the emergency, the telephone number of the caller, and the nature of the call, then they will determine which resources are needed to be dispatched and notify these resources. After the ambulance is then dispatched, the dispatcher will return to the caller to obtain the rest of the information and then relay this information to the responding units. Most EMS systems utilize a computer-assisted dispatch type system called a CAD system. And they make use of linked dispatch center computer consoles, and these may be linked to vehicle-mounted mobile data terminals or tablets. This enables the dispatcher to view all the information about the call using visual prompts and list key questions to ask the caller. They may display maps looking up the fastest route for the location. They may see prior calls to the same address and if there's any known hazards at that address, for an example. They may make recommendations about which EMS units to dispatch on the location of the response. If the GIS system is up and running and the GPS locators are on all of the vehicles working properly, then the dispatcher can dispatch the closest available unit as well. After dispatching that appropriate resource and alerting any of the responders of any special circumstances, the dispatcher then will return to the telephone and inform the caller as to what's happening and the fact that somebody is responding. The dispatcher may be able to provide some pre-arrival medical instructions to the caller through the EMD program. And it is important for the dispatcher to remain aware of what is occurring in the field and to stay in contact with the ambulance and other responders. The dispatcher basically is your resource for contacting other agencies as this may become necessary. It's often called Smart 911, what we've been talking about. Pre-arrival instructions. The EMD tabs, like I said before, they pull up and they may have instructions that the bystanders may or may not be willing to do, but they can instruct them on some of the things that they can. For an example, a choking patient, they may coach them through the Heimlich maneuver as an example to try to help the patient out prior to our arrival. EMS communication systems, we have a variety of communications equipment available to us. The communication systems and devices use radio signals basically to send and receive information to and from. We have the basic two-way radio, we have computerized radio systems, and we also have cellular technology that we've been talking about. Backup communication systems, again, are an essential part of the system, and there's nothing worse when communications go down and the backup system also does not work correctly. So we should test our backup systems on a regular basis as well. Basic communications, the theory behind it, a radio transmits signals by electromagnetic waves, basically. The radio frequency is the number of cycles per second that is measured in hertz. Common abbreviations are hertz, which is cycle per second, kilohertz, which is 1,000 cycles per second, megahertz, 1 million cycles per second, and gigahertz, 1 billion cycles per second. Frequencies are grouped into bands by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, and they're grouped for specific purposes. Two most commonly used bands for medical communications are the very high frequency, or VHF band, and also the ultra high frequency, or known as the UHF band. VHF extends from 30 to 300 megahertz, where the ultra high frequency band extends from 300 to 3 gigahertz, 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. Effective July 1 of 2013, frequencies in the public safety radio spectrum between 150 and 174 megahertz and 421 to 470 megahertz were reassigned with a spacing of 12.5 kilohertz. and referred to as the narrow band technology. All right, radios using the older 25 kilohertz technology may no longer be used. This system has doubled the number of frequencies available for public safety use and for EMS use, and it supports the newer, more sophisticated digital radio systems. So when this mandate came out in 2013, this is when we saw a lot of radio systems change over to digital. So a lot of counties, a lot of people that were at the crossroads of needing to upgrade radio equipment at this time did so all at one time, and they upgraded everything to digital. Radio communications require two types of devices. A transmitter takes data and sound and converts it into radio signal and then transmits it on the designated frequency. A receiver collects the radio signal and translates it back into data or sound. Transceivers, which is a two-way radio, contain both the transmitter and the receiver. The range is a limiting factor that affects all radio signal. And this depends on the output power of the radio itself, frequency that's being used, location and the size of the antenna, and whether or not an uninterrupted path to the receiver exists. Background noise is present on all radio frequencies. Keep that in mind. And radio receivers are equipped with filtering systems known as squelches. Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. This is the federal agency that controls all non-governmental communications within the United States. The FCC allocates and monitors U.S. radio frequencies and radio traffic. They assign VHF bands for general emergencies and assign UHF bands for ambulance to hospital telemetry. EMS systems must perform communications checks on a routine basis. With your UHF band on transmitting telemetry, one of the things that is probably more available and being used more widely now today is your cellular communications for the use of transmitting telemetry from your monitors to the hospital. So typically a Verizon or a AT&T setup within that county as an example, and those are two of the bigger vendors, more reliable vendors. But that's usually the cellular companies, one of those will be responsible for the setup and use of the system for telemetry. FCC regulations. The FCC is the agency, again, that regulates U.S. radio and television communication. And they issue the radio licenses. So you have to be licensed, for the radio frequencies. They allocate those frequencies appropriately, and they develop the technical standards for those. They establish and enforce the rules and regulations for operating radio equipment. So basically the FCC monitors transmissions on various frequencies, and they conduct spot checks of base stations to ensure that they are licensed properly. Fines can be imposed for failing to follow the FCC rules and regulations. These regulations ensure that frequencies for emergency medical use are confined to just that. The FCC is against the use of obscenities. They do not allow transmission of non-medical messages on these frequencies. They do monitor these frequencies, You don't hear about things about it a lot until there's a problem, or a certain service or state has had a problem, and the FCC, it makes the news basically, and the FCC has to step in. The components of our communication system, we start with the base stations. The transmitter output power on your base stations can be up to 275 watts. They reach a lot further out. They have a fixed location. Could be the dispatch center. A base station could be located in the hospital, in the ERs. The base stations also can be located at your service station or your barracks. They serve as dispatch and coordination areas, and they can have larger antenna, usually situated on top of the building or on a tall mast, often capable of operating on multiple frequencies and multiple bands. Mobile transceivers, which is our two-way radios that are mounted on vehicles and aircraft. The antenna usually it's externally mounted on the vehicle itself, and the output power of our mobile units are anywhere from 5 to 50 watts. They don't reach out quite as far. And then we have our portable transceivers, small battery-powered units, often known as handsets, often called walkies, handhelds. Walkie-talkies is an older term used. The range of these is usually limited to around 3 to 5 miles, basically line of sight, if you will, and they're useful when you must work at a distance from your vehicle. Radio systems themselves can be simplex, duplex, multiplex, or digital. With simplex, all the transmissions are on the same frequency and allow multiple users to communicate with each other using one common frequency. This usually is used only for short-range type communications. Duplex is where radio signals are transmitted on one frequency but then received on a second frequency. Semi-duplex systems allow the communication in only one direction at a time, where full duplex systems will allow continuous communication in both directions at the same time. Multiplex utilize radio signals to carry multiple streams of audio and or data at the same time. And these are used to transmit voice and ECG tracings, telemetry, so on and so forth. Digital systems allow the transmission of digital signals, computerized or analog, which is voice signals, that have been digitized and then compressed by a computer. And then they can communicate with other digital and sometimes analog radios. So basic communication system that uses simplex, you're sending voice or maybe even just telemetry, and it's using one frequency. So a portable unit to a base unit back and forth as an example. Duplex transmissions allow, again, the simultaneous two-way communications. And with your duplex, just a reminder that it's not at the same time and it's transmitting on one frequency and it is receiving on a second frequency. And then again, multiplex systems, they can transmit voice and data at the same time. And again, you're transmitting on one frequency and receiving on a different frequency. Components of our communication systems. One of the components, another component is repeaters. You may have heard this term before. It's a specialized base station transceiver with a powerful transmitter and a large antenna. Typically, these are located on high spots such as towers, mountaintops or hilltops or even tall buildings. They're able to pick up weak signals and then transmit them at a higher power on another frequency. This basically extends the range of low power portable radios, and it allows the radio system to cover a larger geographic area and bypass obstacles. Sharing of frequencies and repeaters via encoded radio systems. This allows multiple users to share frequencies and repeaters. Continuous tone-coded squelch system, CTCSS, is most common type in public safety. Those who have a CTCSS decoder will be able to receive the transmission, and receivers without it will not be able to do that. Dual tone multi-frequency DTMF systems, tones are encoded using the keypad on a transmitter. These DTMF is used most frequently by systems using the ultra-high frequency band on med channels. Digital trunking systems, sophisticated digital communications network that operates in the range of 800 to 900 megahertz UHF bands. These systems utilize multiple repeaters and computers to route the radio traffic within the system. The transceiver is set to a channel or mode rather than a frequency. Each mode is designed for a particular use or purpose. The network assigns each transmission to the next available frequency. And then we need to be aware of dead spots, radio dead spots. Dead spots are areas where mobiles or portable radios are unable to communicate with the repeater system or each other. Dead spots may be caused by distance or obstructions. And no matter what system that you're in or county, geographically, you're going to have some dead spots. And when they go to replace towers and repeaters within the system, they come out and they do a survey basically, and they find these dead spots, and they try to place your towers and your repeaters within the system to cut out these dead spots altogether if possible. Interoperability is with mutual aid agreements with neighboring jurisdictions. We need and want the ability to work with one another. And so with this, our local agencies will enter into these agreements. And this is to offer assistance to one another. Could be large events, could be in the event that we run out of resources. Each agency's communication system must be compatible with that of the other agency. This principle is referred to as interoperability. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the SafeCom communications program, they came up with this to address the issue of incompatible radio systems being between agencies. These national interoperability standards that were released in 2006 are intended to develop a system of interoperable public safety communications across all local, tribal, state, and federal first responder communication systems. These natural standards became a necessity, and especially after 9/11 occurred and the Department of Homeland Security was formed, we started updating and upgrading communication systems across the United States. These standards identify basically the use of nationally standardized frequencies for disasters and other type of communications. They are used for interstate and national events. Each state has established its own internal standards for interoperability between local jurisdictions, which are to be used for multiple casualty incidents and other local mutual aid type responses. The Project 25 or P25 standards are digital radio hardware standards that are established by the Association of Public Safety Commission. And this ensures or would ensure the pieces of digital radio equipment supplied by different manufacturers to the public safety community are compatible with one another. And again, this project with SafeCom was again around the time that we began to, there's a push in the United States to put everything on the digital platform. Cellular technology, we know this is handy to us. Just nearly every one of us have a cell phone or a smartphone in our pocket. Some of you may have one in your hand right now as I'm talking. With our cellular technology, the cell phones are commonly used in EMS communication systems. This is a low power portable radio device basically. We communicate through interconnected repeater stations called cells or cell towers. And basically this is linked by computer systems and connected to a telephone network. Paramedics need to know commonly used phone numbers such as medical control, your local hospital ER numbers, dispatch center, poison controls. These are all important numbers. And in the field, I would commonly keep all of these numbers in my personal cell phone as well. If one cell phone's not working, another one may be working fine. You have that backup. Put those numbers in your phones and use them. Smartphones have basically brought previously unheard of capabilities to your fingertips, basically, and to us as EMS providers. You must be aware of the privacy implications of taking photographs or videos using your smartphones or your tablets, because basically they allow users to communicate wirelessly using voice, text, and video, take and send photographs or videos to and from other devices, use GPS receivers with mapping software and GIS software, and access a huge range of medical applications. So certainly your cellular technology and our smartphones are very handy, but do remember that the photographs and the videos with your own personal smartphones can pose an issue with privacy. And so a lot of times if there are photographs that need to be taken, use the company phone that you're working for. That most departments are keeping cell phones on each ambulance as a backup way of communications. Be leery of using your personal phone, and understand that if you use it and there's something that becomes evidence, such as those videos or pictures, your cell phone is now evidence. And if you were to destroy or delete any of that and it became known, you can be liable and held to consequence for it. ACNs or automatic crash notification technology is another evolving use of cellular technology. This utilizes special onboard computers in motor vehicles to then send data to a monitoring station in the event of a crash. This data could include geographic location of the crash, the type of vehicle, the severity of the crash, based on the computer system. It detects, airbags being deployed and the speeds and the braking systems, how they're used. Principal direction of force, the point of impact could be denoted as well. Whether the seatbelts are in use and whether airbags are or were deployed. This may allow direct two-way voice communication with the occupants of the vehicle. One of the well-known systems from General Motors is OnStar. Satellite communications. Satellite phones can be valuable in rural and remote areas with unreliable or absent radio and cell phone coverage. One thing about this technology is it is very expensive. The global positioning or GPS system is the satellite network that utilizes handheld or vehicle-mounted receivers to locate the user's position and then provide directions to other locations. Geographic Information System, or GIS technology, utilizes computerized GPS mapping systems to track and predict your response times, determine the distance to the closest trauma center or other hospitals from a specific location. It may track the frequency of motor vehicle crashes and the severity of injuries from different geographical locations. Determine the location of the emergency helipads. It may help provide other information that's useful in the EMS system for operations and planning. Satellite distress beacons and messengers can be a worthwhile safety technology for ambulances and emergency medical personnel who operate in rural or remote locations or during search and rescue and disaster type operations. I can't think of any place in the state of Kentucky right off that are using satellite phones and communications regularly other than the GPS and the GIS portions. When I was in the military, we used satellite comms and telephones often. They are very expensive pieces of equipment. However, they are fairly reliable. Backup systems. This is a necessary thing for all of our public safety communication systems. Most systems include landline and cell phone networks as your backup to radio communications. In disaster situations, having redundant systems or backup systems is essential. That backup plan may include the use of amateur radio groups, ARES, or amateur radio services, your ham operators, if you will. All these can be utilized. Biotelemetry is the measurement and transmission of vital signs and other physiologic data to a remote terminal. It is mostly used to send ECG data to medical control physicians in our ERs. This telemetry has been used less frequently over the past decade because paramedics are more skilled in the recognition of dysrhythmias and our 12-lead recognition and our STEMIs. We rely solely on the paramedic's assessment and rarely require confirmation by a physician. In some systems, it is required to transmit. The physician will then have a look at that ECG and then make a determination as well. And it gives them a view so they can start getting their cath lab ready potentially if they have one, and start mobilizing people for that. Two developments occurred to bring reassessment of pre-hospital ECG telemetry. The National Standard of Care for Patients with an Acute ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction, or known as a STEMI, is percutaneous coronary intervention, or PCIs, or cardiac catheterization. Rapid transport times of patients directly to the closest primary PCI hospital or STEMI receiving center has been known to result in much better patient outcomes. Cell phone, broadband networks, and digital radio systems made it possible to transmit 12-lead ECG from a moving ambulance to the hospital, and can diagnose STEMIs basically can be diagnosed before the patient reaches the hospital, and then in turn make appropriate destination and treatment decisions ahead of time. Telemedicine technology uses specialized computer terminals and networks that permit secure two-way transmission of diagnostic data. This allows the interactive exchange of information between the paramedic and the medical control physician, and can facilitate rapid assessment and treatment of a wide range of conditions and patients in the pre-hospital setting. Advancements in technology are occurring rapidly. This is something that occurs on a regular basis. EMS systems must be able to keep up with the technology, and that's going to improve our communications of the patient information. Communicating by radio, the effectiveness of our communications network depends on a couple things. One, our technical hardware and software, and basically the people that are using it. The FCC requires that frequencies allocated for emergency medical use are confined to that use. The use of obscenities and transmissions that are unrelated to medical services are strictly forbidden. To communicate a personal message, notify a recipient by radio to contact the base by phone. And then to communicate a personal request to the dispatcher, simply use a telephone. So a lot of times we'll state on the radio, give me a public service or give me a phone call on my cell. Clarity of our transmission. The following guidelines can help improve the clarity of your transmissions. Know what you want to say before beginning your transmission. Make notes if you got to make notes. Anticipate what questions that you might be asked. But do know what you're going to say before you begin the transmission. Before you begin to transmit, make sure the radio is turned on, check the volume, and then listen to make sure your channel is clear. If another radio transmission is in progress, wait until the parties have finished transmitting before you try to get on the air. Keep your mouth close to the microphone, but not too close. About 2 to 3 inches away is ideal. Once the channel is quiet, press the transmit key or button for at least 1 second before you start speaking. This will ensure that the beginning of your transmission is not cut off or lost. And this is something that you have to do, especially with digital systems, because it takes a minute for that repeater to be engaged and then begin transmitting. Start your transmission with the identifying information, the number or the name of the unit being called first, then your own identification. For example, Williamsburg Hospital, this is Medic 3. Wait then for a response to ensure the other station is listening. Speak slowly and clear, pronouncing each word carefully. Do not shout. Shouting just distorts the signal really bad, and it makes it just inaudible. Speak in a normal pitch, normal tone, keep calm, and try to keep free of emotion. Use a normal conversational tone. Use plain language and only use radio codes that are specifically approved by your system and that everyone is going to understand. And this is something that we fail on. Our dispatch system here doesn't do a good job of this. They use 10 codes that we don't use anymore. And sometimes it gets confusing on what they mean. Plain language, plain English. Everything is digital in our system and it's encrypted, so nobody's going to grab it out of the air and be able to understand it. If you have a lot of information to convey, then break the transmission into short 30-second chunks. And you do so by, at the end of the 30 seconds, you would say break, and whoever the receiver is at some point will say go ahead, and then you continue on with the next 30-second chunk, so on and so forth until you're finished with your transmissions. When you speak a word or a name that might be misunderstood, spell it out using the International Radio Telephonic alphabet or a similar type system. When you're presenting numbers that might be misunderstood. Transmit the number as a whole, then digit by digit. For example, if the respirations were 16, you would then say the respirations are 16, that is 1/6. Confirm the receipt of all replies and then indicate when your transmission is complete. Sometimes you can say over at the end of it. The military does this, and that denotes that that transmission is complete. With the content of our transmissions, radio transmissions should be accurate and concise. Guidelines for what you should and should not include in EMS radio communications include: remember, anyone may be listening. Protect the privacy of patients at all times. We do not use a patient's name over the air. We do not transmit personal information about the patient. We follow HIPAA guidelines and local laws. Do not say anything on the radio or phone you would not want others to hear. Be impersonal. Use we, not I, to refer to yourself. Use proper names and titles to refer to others when necessary. Use proper and correct medical terminology, and avoid using words that are difficult to hear. Examples: affirmative instead of yes, negative instead of no. Act professionally, basically. There's no place for unprofessional behavior, for sarcasm, or other poor conduct on emergency medical radio frequencies. When you receive instructions by radio from the dispatcher or from medical control, echo the order back to make certain you have understood it correctly. Question any orders you did not hear clearly or did not understand. If you have a lot of information to convey, again, break your transmission into the short 30-second chunks. When you're finished transmitting, notify the receiver that the transmission is finished. This can be as simple as saying over, like the military does, or end of transmission. Codes. Most 10 code systems and other radio codes have been phased out in most EMS systems under the new NIMS. This should have been phased out years ago and should not be currently used by anyone. A medical priority dispatch, or MPDS, is used by many EMS systems. It uses a specific format to indicate the nature of the emergency and the priority. The dispatcher uses the information to decide the priority and response mode when assigning the responding units. The National Incident Management System, or NIMS, discourages the use of all radio codes. The preferred format is clear text or basic language. This type of communication is the preferred communication format, again, and simply means using regular language and accepted terms to communicate. Communications formats used during the different phases of your response. Each agency or region's radio and other communication may have different formats, so familiarize yourself with the format that's being used in the area. Respond to the dispatcher that you have received the message. You acknowledge it, you have received it. Confirm the location and call reference. This basically ensures that there has been an effective and accurate transfer of information, and it does establish your dispatch time. So that this basically is the feedback portion of the loop that we talked about in the very first part of our presentation. Response to the scene communications: as you travel toward the scene, notify dispatch. This lets them know that you're on the way, and it will establish your en route time. So that's when we go en route. Your next transmission should be your arrival upon the scene. This allows you to update dispatch and establishes, again, your arrival time. This can be used to record your observations and findings regarding the scene as well. And it's an opportunity to A, give pre-arrival instructions to other responding agencies where that may be applicable, and B, call for additional resources. And then I realize a lot of times we are calling for additional resources well before this point, and that certainly is appropriate to call for them immediately when you recognize you might need them, because we can always turn them away. General radio procedures use the echo procedure when receiving directions and orders, so we would repeat it back to make sure that everything is clear and it was understood and that there wasn't any mistakes. Always write down important information. Simply write it down. Write it down on the back of your glove, write it down on your notepad, whatever you have available with you. Obtain confirmation when completing the transmission. Again, we have feedback and we know that transmission occurred. On-scene communication and tactical communications, you need to stay in contact with other responders at the scene. So this is typically accomplished using a portable radio on the assigned tactical channel. Could be a large-scale incident, and it may need a more involved communication plan. Patient transport communications. After we have treated our patients and you're ready to provide transport, inform the dispatch you're en route to, that you're departing from the scene and you're en route to the receiving facility. This gives a timestamp on you've left the scene and you're now en route to the hospital or receiving facility. The next radio transmission to dispatch is to notify them of your arrival at the medical facility. And this confirms arrival at the hospital. It's going to establish that timestamp and status of your unit. And it documents the unit's unavailability for further service at that particular time. Once you have turned over patient care, you've given a report, you're restocked and ready to go, and then you can update the dispatcher that you're then back in service. Relaying information to medical control on the legal basis for paramedic practice. Offline medical control allows a paramedic to perform certain procedures or treatments based on protocol, known as standing orders, or basically without making contact to a physician. Online medical control is when the physician gives patient-specific orders and instructions directly to the paramedic by either telephone or by radio. And again, use the echo effect when you are receiving these orders and write it down. Radio communications between paramedics and physicians should be concise and accurate. Using a standard format for communicating with medical control will ensure information is relayed consistently and completely. Reporting your medical information. The format for reporting this information, the key to good radio reports. We want to give good radio reports, and the key to that is be organized, have a systematic way to deliver that, know what you want to say again before beginning your transmission, and include all the required information. The following medical information should be included in your radio report: destination facility, your estimated time of arrival, your patient's age, sex, chief complaint, brief history of the illness or the injury that's occurred, medications and important allergies, and anything else from their medical history that's relative to the current situation or status. This can include major underlying medical conditions, the patient's level of consciousness, and the degree of distress, and basically anything that you've done. When I did this, I had a set way that I would mark up, med twos en route to your facility with a 68-year-old female patient, chief complaint of chest pain, and then I would go right on down through the entire history assessment real quick, of the pertinent things and any treatments that I had established, and then I would give them an estimated arrival time. When we're reporting, we want to report the patient's medical status as well. Again, vital signs in this and the pertinent physical findings from your head to toe. ECG findings, if you've transmitted it, the fact you transmitted it, and then treatments that you've given so far. So again, you're going to go down the line. And when you call in this report, you're going to call in all these things all the way down through. I always did an ETA at the end of mine. I tried to keep mine reports short and sweet and to the point. Transmit your information quickly, completely, and again in that well-organized fashion. Reduce the physician's need to ask questions or to get essential information. Basically, we're gathering all this information up, and we keep it organized, keep it to the point and concise, and they're not going to have very many questions to ask. Again, gather information thoroughly at the scene and organize it clearly before we make the report, and continue to monitor and assess the patient. And you can call back and report any changes on the way as well. When we transfer care, we're communicating. We communicate to the doctors and to the nurses in receiving facilities. This is the final phase of your patient contact communication or your patient care communication. And this is your bedside report to the receiving facility, the medical staff there. So we relay all pertinent information. Use the same format as your radio reports. Share any information that was not already provided. Sometimes things come up or you didn't provide something on the radio, and you can share that then. Keep in mind the patient and the family may be standing nearby and listening. Certainly your patient can hear you. Step outside the patient care room or speak softly when you transfer information to the medical staff. And that just helps ensure that in closer quarters and some ERs that other people aren't hearing things that they don't really need to hear. Answer all questions from the medical and nursing staff that they may have, and then your patient handoff would involve written documentation. So we give those certain pieces or so many pieces of information that are required, as well as we obtain the required signatures on our end. Medical terminology, learn the established medical terms and the established abbreviations. Each EMS system will have an approved list of terms. In our medical protocols, at the very beginning, there is a list of proper medical terminology, abbreviations, and terms that are acceptable to be used within our system. And this is something that you need to know and use on a regular basis. Strategies to elicit useful responses to questions. Reflection may be repeating a word or a phrase a patient has used to encourage more detail. For an example, a patient says, I can't catch my breath, and then you would in turn say, you said you can't catch your breath. And the patient may then respond more fully, explaining the condition and the circumstances in a little bit more detail. This technique can produce more information than the patient has originally given. We can use empathy, putting yourself in the patient's position. An example, if a patient expresses sadness or despondency about a situation, such as a recent death, you may say something like, I'm terribly sorry. I don't know how I would feel in that situation, but I'm sure I would feel similar. Confrontation. This involves making your patients aware that you understand something is inconsistent about their story. Do remain professional and non-judgmental. And an example of this could be if a patient is in a motor vehicle accident and denies drinking alcohol, say anything that you tell me is confidential, and I detect the smell of alcohol on your breath. There were also some empty bottles and containers in your vehicle. It is important you tell me the truth so that I can make sure that we and the hospital staff can take proper care of you. And this technique helps us assess the level of distress and whether, how aggravated they are. We may use interpretation, vocalize that you think the patient is saying, and invite the patient to correct you. So this can be used when you are not sure what the patient is trying to tell you, or a patient refuses to give needed information. So an example, if a teenager acts distressed and says she is afraid she might hurt her parents if she tells them what's wrong, and says her parents don't like her boyfriend, then you might ask the question like, this may be totally wrong, but I must ask you the question so I can inform the doctor for your well-being. Do you think you are pregnant? Interpretation requires the best intuition and diplomatic skills. Possible phrase to begin with this: so if you understand what you are saying correctly, as an example. Facilitation: use phrases to encourage patients to provide more information. Examples: please say more, or please feel welcome to tell me about this. And then silence. If patients seem to be trying to put something into words, but the patient and be patient and do not say anything for a few seconds. So kind of let it hang out there and soak in. We may use clarification, asking patients to explain what they mean if you do not understand. We may use redirection. If patients mention something in passing or avoid a certain question, politely redirect their attention to it until you get an answer. And then we may use simplification and summarization. If a patient's response it becomes confusing or disorganized, try summarizing their comments in simpler terms and see if whether they agree or disagree. Language interpretation: the biggest communication challenge with members of other cultures is a situation in which no common language exists. And so it may be impossible to perform a good assessment and good history in this situation. Use a qualified interpreter when possible. When we deal with a patient who speaks another language, you should always assume you are missing something important in your history and your assessment and act accordingly. These are language barriers can be difficult situations, especially if somebody is hurt, injured, and they're trying to communicate to you, but we can't understand. It is wise to have interpreters in the department, people that can speak the second most common language, such as Spanish is one that can be helpful. There are computer programs and translator services that we can use via telephone as well that can help with our situation. So we've talked about a whole lot of different things in our presentation today. Communication it's a vital important thing in our job. We are continually and constantly communicating back and forth, and so always think back to that loop: the sender, receiver, message, medium, the transmission of that message, and then ultimately we seek feedback and realize that context does matter. And when we do a nonverbal and we are communicating via text and chat messaging, that context is often kind of left out there for interpretation. You can use emoticons and the little pictures in there to help convey, the feeling and the context of that. And another thing to remember is just because we have all 4 of these things or 5 of these things in place doesn't mean that communication has taken place. And an example of that would be if I came in and Chief was sitting at his desk and he's typing away and he's working on a document on the computer, and I kind of sneak in his office there and I'm standing at the corner of the desk, and so I say, "Hey Chief, I wanted to run something by you real quick," and then I deliver this message to him. Maybe I'm asking a question, and the whole time he's looking at his computer, he's typing, he's like, okay, yeah, okay. And before we know it, he's really not listening. Things are not soaking in. And the next thing you know, I walk away and he's sitting there thinking, what just happened? What did I just agree to? So just because all those things are in place doesn't mean proper communication has occurred. So again, feedback, context, those things do matter. And picking the right time and to ensure that your receiver is listening as well. Use active listening yourself. Make eye contact if you're face to face and verbal, those kind of things. If anybody has any questions, feel free to let myself or Joe Sebastian know. You can email me at mfelty@frankfurt.kentucky.gov. This concludes our lesson on communications. Have a great day.